I'm Bowman Trayford. I run Renegade applications, and I've been developing games as a hobby for the last 2 years.
And now presenting Game Developers Like You, here's Chris Delio.
And I've run 2 games.
And those games are Cover the Core and Codefall?
Yes, they are.
Do you want to tell us about those? Maybe starting with Cover the Core.
Sure. Cover the Core is kind of an expansion of a breakout type game where you're protecting the inside walls of a nuclear reactor vessel and trying to shut down that core to prevent it from overheating and exploding.
And this is played on iPhone, right?
Yeah. So you hold the phone and you tilt it around and move a reflector to protect the inside walls of the reactor vessel using the gyro and the accelerometers inside the phone.
And so some of the other elements that I see on screen, we've got chain link fences that kind of block certain parts of the territory. There's little, what are the things you're breaking in the center?
Those are the fuel rods for the reactor vessel.
Gotcha. And then there's power-ups of various kinds, it looks like.
Yeah, so you different power-ups. You can speed up the reflector that you're using. You can make it bigger. Some of the power-ups actually cause healing for the walls of the vessel. Other power-ups actually refill the vessel if you've lost some of the coolant inside. That helps keep the fuel from overheating.
And so Cover the Core, it's a 3D game for iPhone. It wasn't Sprite Kit. It looks kind of like Unity, but I think you mentioned it wasn't.
No, so when I started developing it with iOS 5, I'm just using Apple's Xcode to do that. They didn't even have Sprite Kit yet for iOS, and so I was writing my own physics engine and using OpenGL, and then Apple came out with Sprite Kit, and I happily ripped out my sort of functional physics engine and used theirs because it was a bazillion times better and easier to use. But I had to keep the OpenGL because they didn't get to SceneKit till after I was almost done with the game, and I wasn't gonna go back and try and use SceneKit instead.
Gotcha. And was this your first game programming that you'd attempted?
That was my very first game, yeah. So it was in many ways the classic, I'm gonna do this giant game, and I cut so much out of it that it was a completely different game when I finished, and then it was still giant game.
What was kind of your initial vision for it? Then kind of how did it change along the way?
Well, I didn't keep any specific notes on what the original vision was because I quickly realized that I wasn't going to get there. But I did intend to have a lot more levels in it. Right now, the only levels that you can complete are the ones represented by power plants in North America. But I also did all of the research necessary to create the levels for power plants in Asia and in Europe as well, which would have been many hundred more levels.
And then were you able to get in much testing? And one of our challenges with hobby development is always kind of like, how do you get it in front of even just tester people, but maybe at the very least friends or family?
Yeah, so that's been a huge, huge problem. So my wife was willing to give Cover the Core a try a couple of times, even though she doesn't really play a lot of those kinds of games. And that was helpful. And a friend who has an app on the App Store called Moonjump, he runs Corporate Underground. He was able to give it some tries for me and tell me things like, I don't know what to do and what's the object and how do you play, so that I knew that I had some work to do at the very beginning parts of the game there. But that was really the limit of what I was able to do besides me. So it's been hard.
But like I said, even just a couple of those testers can already just be immensely helpful we can just so much take for granted. Like we know how to play it. We know what our objective is. And unless we've like really, really just adhered to some existing convention or game pattern, people have no idea.
Oh yeah. When my friend, sent me a message back saying, what's the objective? I was just like, oh, wow. Missed the mark.
I've had those happen where my reflex is to try to answer like they asking me about the story. And they're like, no, I don't understand what I'm supposed to try to do.
Right.
And I'm like,
right. Yeah,
that's the next level. That's pretty immense to go into your first game programming project as OpenGL and then shifting your physics engine halfway into it and so on. What was your programming experience like before you got into programming games?
Well, so as a child, I did some programming using BASIC with a computer that doesn't have a hard drive, and so you couldn't keep anything, So that was real minimal exposure to programming there. But then in college, I did some Fortran programming for some thermodynamic analysis things for my undergrad.
And so I'm sure that ties in at least a little bit as to why Cover the Cores is a nuclear-themed game.
Right, yeah. So professionally, I do some work with the nuclear power program. So that's kind of where I got some of my thoughts and ideas when I was scrambling about, okay, I've got an idea for a game, but it needs a theme that is the veneer over the gameplay that I already knew I wanted.
So I'm sort of a pinball nut. A bunch of my research and graduate school work is about pinball. And so, there'd be these machines where it'd be like, okay, well, they have a certain mechanic they want to make, and it's underwater, or it's in space. But like it's almost disconnected, and so I am curious as to what extent your nuclear theme kind of drove gameplay, or to what extent it really was like, well, here's this mechanic idea I have, and here's a theme.
In many ways, the theme just kind of got painted over the top. It affected some of the audio that I had to slap in there, and actually trying to get the water level to drain down inside the reactor vessel as you like rotate it around and still keep the water. The surface of the water level with the ground was exceptionally hard.
That was actually one of the things that I thought visually was one of the most interesting, or at least unique things about the game, where so very much, it's a 3D game for people who are trying to picture this. You've got kind of a breakout paddle sliding along the 4 walls or 3 walls, depending on the level. And now, even though that sort of takes place in sort of a 2D plane of action, the water is like kind of a 3D thing in this bucket that as you're tilting the phone, you can see the top of the sill, like, if you hold the phone flat, you see kind of a whole different angle of the water than if you hold it up in front of your face.
Right, yeah. So that's exactly it. That's a great way to describe it, is like holding a bucket and looking down into it as you rotate it around. Yeah, I can't believe how difficult that turned out to be. If I had known beforehand, I'd have picked a different theme.
Attitudes vary, and I think mine's I've talked about enough on this podcast as to like the benefits and pros and cons of taking on this big project first versus doing some smaller stepping stone stuff into it. Do you feel like at the very least you got some benefit for having gone down that, okay, I tried my big idea, I tried this big thing, wrestled with it long enough? What were at least some of the pros to come away from that, in addition to obviously like, well, there's probably some frustration too.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Writing most of a semi-functional physics engine was really helpful. I got to understand what goes into doing that and had better appreciation for what it is that SpriteKit is doing for me now that I'm using that. And understanding OpenGL certainly helps with the idea of Apple's Metal API, and certainly gives me an idea of what's going on under the hood when I use SpriteKit's drawing options. Definitely value there.
Nice.
The funny thing is, I thought, okay, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna make the game that is just too big to finish. But I did.
It's we joke about, okay, you got to make your first game simple, and people's first simple ideas are often much more complicated than it sounds like they are. Where even though it was sort of a breakout theme dish, and as much as there's a paddle and a ball, it was still just, there's so many power ups and graphics and sounds and stuff, even for such a modest game. Now you've you've moved on to SpriteKit for your newer game, Codefall. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So Codefall, the idea was to use kind of a Tetris type of idea where you have objects dropping from the top of the screen, but instead of drawing a line, creating lines of boxes across the screen, you write lines of code with characters that are falling. So it's kind of a Matrix or Digital Rain theme as the characters drop from the top of the screen, and you tap them, and then you tap on the screen where you want the character to go to try and write the lines of code.
Oh, you're kind of catching these characters as they move past you, and then lining them up to form expressions.
Yes, exactly.
And I think from what I've seen, like at least on the YouTube video, the game's not out yet, right? Cover the Core is out, but Codefall's still in development.
Yeah, so Cover the Core's been out for almost a year, almost exactly a year actually.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Codefall was submitted yesterday. Yes, thank you.
Hey, congrats on that also then.
Thank you.
Well, and so I think I've seen in the YouTube video, since I wasn't able to play it yet, you're forming expressions like var I equals 5 or whatever, semicolon.
Yes.
And so what was the sort of path, or where did those come generated from, or how was that plan formed as you developed this game?
Well, so originally I thought, it would be super cool to play a game where you write code, because, I love writing code. I enjoy it a lot. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll make a game doing that. And then I realized, I don't know how to write a compiler, so I put the game away for a while, and then I came back to it because I just couldn't get away from the idea. It was just locked in my mind. And so I thought, okay, well, what if I make it so you can only use 3 or 4 of the keywords out of a typical programming language like var, let, return, just some of the real basic ones, so you can just write some simple code. Can I create a parser that can recognize that and kind of create the opportunity for players to write most any basic line of code they want to? And so went with that and ran into some trouble where I let some of my friends try it out, and just as soon as they got into that mode where it was time for them to actually start creating the code, they were like, "What do I do?" It was I think that with the time pressure to write a line of code, people's minds just go blank if they even understand what it is that I was asking for them to do at that point.
I mean, heck, even handing someone like random English words and having them trying to like write a phrase with it, it might be hard without some sort of clear direction of like, what's the context for this phrase, or what are the parameters? And then programming being even less natural for most folks.
Right. And, and with no idea, like when you're writing a program, like you understand what it is you want the program to do. And that kind of gives you that context you were talking about. Whereas when you're just writing a random line of code without any guidance on where it goes in a program or what it should do for you, that makes it even harder, I think. So I ended up having to make an extended tutorial to give people an idea of how to play, and then they were still having trouble on what to do. Eventually, somebody recommended to me, "Hey, look, what about just levels instead of just like this open game field? How about different levels of the game?" So I went down that road, and that actually turned out to be a lot easier because I could just test whether the line of code you wrote matches the string I told you to write, as opposed to having to parse it.
And that's something too that I know oftentimes it takes so many iterations of test to figure out that maybe the game here people can understand is a lot simpler than what I thought I was trying to build anyway.
Yes. And actually, I think somebody else suggested to me, "Hey, what about like a meta game? Like, okay, you're going to tell me what line of code to write, but what if the objective was to write an actual program that does something, and can you show the players their progress through that other program?"
Ooh.
Which I really, really like. That was a wonderful suggestion. It's not in the version that I submitted to the App Store. That's going to be the next version. It's going to have to go in.
Right now, the lines are just either random or maybe based on a difficulty sequence, but they're not like forming a full program altogether. That's something you might look at doing for a later one.
Yeah, so that'll have to be that'll be what I work on for the next version of that game. I'll just add another gameplay mode. So right now there's like the free play mode, which here's the screen, have at it. And then there's the levels mode where I say, okay, now write this line of code. And then when you finish that, now do this line of code. Those are the 2 modes available now. And then I'll try and add the progressive mode in the next iteration.
There's lots of ways that things can be educational. And I don't know if education is like the main objective, but even people building up familiarity with seeing kind of programming looking expressions and getting a little more comfortable with those kind of in its own right? Like at the introductory level might be helping somebody out.
Right. Yes. I hadn't originally intended for it to be a teaching game or an educational game, but I think that it might very well do its best in that realm. And so I'm definitely moving more and more in that direction with it. It would be wonderful if somebody was able to pick up Codefall and start to understand some of what was going on and pick up some of the passion that I have for coding.
To spark an interest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your decision to develop games for iPhone, is that a product of just kind of like a matter of arbitrary choice? Is it a matter of you there's certain things you like about this platform and its forms of input and display? What led you down that road as opposed to one of the other platforms or ways we can make games?
Well, it's been a couple of years since I was in college doing my procedural programming, but I found myself a little bit of time, and so I was looking for a hobby, and programming came to mind. And at the time, I had a BlackBerry. I tried writing some apps for my BlackBerry, and I just couldn't do it. It was so hard, and I don't know. I think what it was is that I was trying to apply my procedural programming knowledge to the object-oriented language that the BlackBerry was using, and I didn't understand the difference there. So I switched over to Java, and I got some real basic books and figured out my major malfunction there. And in the meantime, I got an iPhone. I got my first iPhone at that point. And so then when I started looking at trying to write a new app, I didn't have a BlackBerry to test on. I had an iPhone. So there we go.
Back when I used to own a BlackBerry, there was like 1 or 2 games that I had. I'm sure they've built up a market since, but just not at the same level of support out there. Because, the more popular a platform is, the more you can find answers on forums. You can find people have run into these problems before. Just helps immensely versus having to be first penguin at, first time someone's tried to do X, Y, or Z on a platform.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I have no idea if I was in the first time somebody's trying to do something, because I was coming from so far away from the programming world at that point that I didn't know what any of the forums were. I didn't have any way to get any help. I was definitely lost in the forest at that point.
And maybe because someone out there might be able to sympathize, how long, and hopefully you don't have to stay feeling it, but how long were you kind of in that forest of this does not feel right, but you still kept pushing through it?
I probably spent 4 months or so working on the BlackBerry thing before I basically threw all that away and tried with Java. Just tried to learn Java, not even for anything, just to learn it.
In those 4 months, and again, this is certainly not to say like anything wrong with you. This is, I think, an entirely common experience. Like, it wasn't like you were making a bad game in that time. It was like just trying to get something on the screen or working, right? I mean, like,
I could not draw a line. I mean, that's the level I was at. I couldn't get anything to show up on the screen, and if I did, it wasn't where I thought it should be. It was so frustrating. And I think that if you're familiar with procedural programming and you're familiar with object oriented, you can see why using one when you should be using the other, just, you don't get anything useful.
My earliest programming work, I was trying to help with some closed captioning programming stuff for some research application. And I would just grind it on the thing for months and had kind of nothing to show for it. And it was just this really frustrating, like, there's some fundamental thing I'm not grasping here.
Yes. Yeah, and that's exactly what I came to realize, that I just didn't, exactly that. There's something here that I don't understand. And that was frustrating to me because I knew that I understood the basics of programming from my previous experience in college.
I think we lose a lot of potential programmers from people going through that, not realizing everyone goes through that. That's like just part of dealing with programming.
Yes. Well, and I think there are a lot of tools that have come out even in the last 3 or 4 years to really make that transition a lot easier.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is certainly true. Certainly a lot more process support and so on. Now that Codefall is submitted to the store, you said you have at least one more version of it in mind. Is this something, do you like to maintain and keep tinkering on the games with updates for a while, or do you have kind of a plan for game number 3 you want to do, maybe after this next update or two to Codefall?
I do have a series of ideas of things that I'd like to do for Codefall, but I suspect my interest may wane before I get through a lot of that, and I may move on to something else.
You have a whole queue of ideas you want to work on for games. Are some of those things you're comfortable talking about, or are they kind of just so nebulous right now it would be hard to even put some words to?
As far as other games, I have the Magic game that I'd love to make that everybody has, their dream game. Yeah, that's sort of a Legend of Zelda kind of a vision with some other mechanics added into it. But I can tell already that game, the scope of that game and the assets required for are well beyond anything that I have the time or resources to do right now. So I'm just going to have to leave that one on the shelf until I'm better at game programming.
Speaking of assets, right now for all the art and Cover the Core and Codefall, are you doing all the art, the sound, and so on, or are you finding ways to source some of that stuff?
For Cover the Core, I have a friend from elementary school who is an art instructor at a university in Washington State. And I asked him if he could help me out with some of the art stuff, and he said no. He does painting and watercoloring, that kind of stuff. Then he said, but his wife does digital artwork. I was like, well, can she help me? And she did. She created my company logo for Renegade applications, and she also created the image that I use as like the opening scene for Cover the Core. But all the other artwork in Cover the Core was me, and some of the sound effects in Cover the Core are me. But the soundtrack and some of the sound effects came off of SoundCloud, but
just Creative Commons stuff out there.
Exactly. That only needed an attribution kind of a requirement for them. I never even tried with the music. I did try with the sound effects, and I kept some of the ones that I used, but my time was better spent searching through the forums for sounds that were available royalty-free. For Codefall, all of the artwork, all the visual art is me.
It helps that it's code rain, so it's green on black. They're kind of falling from the sky. You're clearly, at least subconsciously, if not very deliberately, designing partly around what's a game with simple enough art that I can fully populate.
Yes, absolutely. I was like, hey, can I make art that's all text? Yep, I can.
Well, which of course is part of where you're like, oh, there's like this Zelda kind of idea, and like even baseline, it's like, nope, either not yet, or you got to find a collaborator or something.
Yeah. So my second game, I was going to do a platformer. I was going to do a 2D platformer, but after I spent a month making art for it, I was like, no, I'm not doing enough coding here, and that's what I enjoy about game development is the coding. So I put that idea on the shelf, and maybe I'll come back to that one.
You're very upfront about like you're making these games as a hobby, which allows you to say things like, I like the programming part. I'm not getting that out of this project. I'm going to do a project where I get to do more programming part.
And I think that there's value in working through some of that. For Codefall, I certainly spent hours creating the art assets, and I think there's value in doing that. But, even just creating all of the art assets for a side-scrolling platformer is going to, for somebody at my skill level, it's going to be months and months of nothing but that.
I mean, the flip side, though, of course, is that someone designs something either ultra minimalist or even more degraded than retro, right? Like worse than NES looking, kind of pixelated. There's ways people try to design around that, but then you run into these problems like, well, that's not the platformer I want to make.
Right. Yeah, but there's that too. Tim Waskett posted on Twitter a couple days ago that he was working on some sort of game that was just a few minutes of gameplay that he was going to use as like a Christmas card or a holiday card for a relative or something. And I thought that was just the most fascinating idea. I absolutely fell in love with that idea.
There's always just neat things where if the game is small enough, you can totally get away with like I said, a Christmas card from Tim Waskett.
Yeah. I think that is a super fun and neat idea, and I'm trying to figure out if I can do something like that because I think it would be fun.
Do you have a certain kind of use in mind?
I have a 7-year-old niece. I would love to give her either a Christmas or a birthday card that was a short little game. I think that would be a ton of fun.
It would force you to design the kind of thing that you can totally just junk out art for or use found stuff for, or basically, unanimated sprites or whatever. Years ago, when I was doing my little experimental gameplay series, interaction artist stuff, I was accepting outside project ideas, and someone wanted, it was like a birthday gift for, I think it was like my brother's roommate's girlfriend's cousin or something, several layers of separation. And so like he had a tattoo, and so we used that tattoo as the health indicator. And she had pictures of his family, and it was like, oh, he drives a black Escort. So I put pictures of his family in a black Escort. And we made this like driving through Hollywood game because his kids like Hollywood. But it was just this incredibly repetitive, incredibly simple, like entirely unplayable, quite frankly. Like there's nothing fun about this game except its existence is just kind of a neat of like, oh my God, neat. I have my own little game with my family in it, which kind of all that it justified for the amount of energy or effort to go into it. But yeah, those things are certainly a lot of fun to explore. So out of those, so you've got your Zelda thing, maybe not yet, platformer thing, maybe not yet, something little kind of for maybe a gift kind of idea. Are there any other kind of ideas that are on your queue of stuff that, you're always kind of in the back burner?
I thought, it would be, what about distributing games using like a multicolor QR code, something that could hold more data than a standard QR code, and enough data that you could put an entire game in the code, and then Space Invaders. Can you put Space Invaders and then you distribute the cards and then you just scan the card and there's a game?
I mean, of course, so the usual answer to these things is that the QR code is some sort of serial database lookup thing, which then downloads the actual code off of some server someplace. But yeah, to make the actual code into the image, very interesting. I'm reminded too of it. There were these really, really old Game Boy games where it came with like a barcode reader, and you would make monsters by like any barcode you would swipe through it would form a monster based on the barcode data.
That's cool.
When it's such a neat concept, I think in reality it was so uninteresting that like no one's even heard of it anymore. I don't know if it's like we could talk about a million problems of why that's hard to execute on. My friend Kate Compton talks about like the infinite unique bowls of oatmeal problem from procedural game generation, where it's like, oh, they're all unique, but like they're all the same.
Yeah.
Because the other day after one of our club meetings out here in LA, they were talking about like, maybe you could use like your cell phone camera, and then based on the colors in the images and the shapes of it, it would like form a creature or stats or something. And I just can't help but feel like in 2015, like the next day on a web forum, if the game was popular, someone would have already optimized and been like, okay, here's the image to take a photo of. It's optimized.
This gives you a superhero.
Yeah. We've used machine learning and thrown 10,000 possibilities at it already. But yeah, that's just this neat question you've got of like, how do you compress data into a tiny computer readable image?
Yeah, I spent some time working on that before I started on Codefall, and I'm surprised at how hard it is.
Oh yeah, you get into these arbitrary questions of encoding, because there's, suppose if you can just take a photo of what it amounts to the data for the zip file of it, and then your thing decompresses it, at least you get rid of a lot of inefficient repetitions and other stuff.
Right.
You can actually do video games with a reduced instruction set, and so if they're sort of like interpreting for a script where they're tapping into existing functionality or something, but there's definitely this very fascinating problem in there.
Yeah. That reminds me of another idea that I had that I can't execute, but I thought it would be fun if you could basically use Twitter to write code. If you wrote a 140 character line of code and I replied to it with another 140, like they would create a 280 character program, and if we could reply back and forth long enough, you could build something that actually, did something.
So it's like Twitch plays Pokemon, but it's like Twitch plays Visual Studio.
Sure.
With a bunch of people just chucking code in there. For anybody listening, are you familiar with Twitch plays Pokemon? I don't know if it's
I'm not.
Okay,
I'm not.
okay. So we have listeners who aren't either. So Twitch is a game streaming service,
right?
And one of the things that they did a while back was they allowed people in the chat rooms for the game to send commands to the Game Boy emulator and be like up, down, B, A, whatever. And so there would just be thousands of people trying to collaboratively play these games.
Okay.
Playing Pokemon together, and it'd be like 4 hours before the character gets out of the first room because it's like walking in circles and bumping into stuff. And then there's some even better ones where like Twitch plays Dark Souls, and naturally just constantly gets just annihilated because it's such as like very timing dependent game being played over the web, let alone with 200 opinions of what to like. They can't get out of the menu screen, right?
Right.
But yeah, like that approach taken to coding is almost like terrifying. From you can only imagine that. Well, hopefully he's got to write something that'll at least compile, which that might be week 3. But then that there's not somebody in there who keeps trying to like turn it into something that's going to crash the machine or divide by 0, no matter what you're coding. Or
yeah. You'd have to have people that all wanted to make Donkey Kong. Everybody knew that was the goal and was willing to give it a go.
Yeah, well, and then maybe there's some sort of collaborative sprint activity going on of like, okay, well, we're going to take these respective components. How quickly can we junk this thing out?
Yeah.
Interesting. It is very clear that the programming is the part that interests you, which now I think you said, so when you came into game programming, it was really like you wanted to do it as a hobby. How did that become the interest point if you had been so long out of programming? Like what pulled you back into it? Actually,
my friend got his app on the App Store, Moonjump. And I thought, you know what, if he can do that, then I'm going to go for it. I'm going to try and get an app on the App Store. So I actually told my wife, my New Year's resolution this year, I'm going to have an app on the App Store by the end of the year. I didn't make it. I didn't make it the next year, but I did make it the year after that.
Well, at least you didn't give up on it, because I think that's one of the mistakes people make. They'll set themselves a goal, and goals are so valuable, not hit the goal, and they'll be like, well, I guess that's it. Yeah. Well, that wasn't the point of setting the goal. It was. Yeah. Well,
I knew when I made the goal that the chances of making it by the end of that first year were almost 0 because, I didn't know Objective-C. I hadn't downloaded Xcode yet. I was almost 0 for that. But, you can't make a New Year's resolution saying I'm going to have something done by the end of next year.
Right. Yeah.
So
well, a lot of it's just right. It's about planting a direction. It's like saying, I'm going north. I'm going towards this thing.
Yeah. So that's how I got back into the programming thing. I just cast about for, what is something that I enjoy doing. And my friend had gotten that app on the store, and I thought, I used to like programming. I'll give it a shot. It's
good to hear you waited through that frustration a bit of it's not like it used to be, but still figured it out. This actually leads back to one of the questions I like to end on for our discussions and stuff of when you meet someone else who's thinking about getting into game programming, what do you tell them? It's either advice, encouragement, or something to look up.
I actually haven't run into anybody. That's one thing I was asking on Twitter a while back was, hey, does anybody know a way to find about meetups, in a person's particular area? Because I don't have any interaction with other game developers.
Right. Well, so let's say that today, hypothetically, there might be hundreds of people listening to you.
Yeah.
Who are other either potential game developers or early game developers. So you're running into them this way.
Yeah. So, I mean, you've asked similar questions of a lot of the people on the podcast, and a lot of people go, with your basic thesis that, pick something up and start really small, recreate, some of the games from the 70s. And I certainly wouldn't and can't argue with that idea. It's clearly the way to go. But in the interest of adding something to the discussion, I would say persistence is the way of programming. You just got to keep working at it. And that doesn't necessarily mean stay up all night long working on a problem, because you might need to walk away and clear your head before you come back to that. But don't give up on it just because you've been stuck for a while.
Yeah. And I think it's such a great point. One of the things and so fortunately you'd already had programming experience from earlier in your life. One of the things I run into from people who, when they're older, they get into it. And so even older, meaning like college age when they're doing first programming, is every time the compiler gives them errors, they feel like they've done something wrong.
Yeah.
And it's like if you hand in a worksheet and it's got red on it, right? It's like,
right.
You screwed this up.
Right.
And it takes a while to get over that mental block of I'm not wasting anyone's time. Like, the computer's not mad at me. This is just part of the process. Errors.
Right. The computer just doesn't know what you said.
Yeah. It's asking for clarification.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah. So persistence. That's an excellent point, and I think fits well for your story of your games. Now, as to close, also for if you want to mention some of your Twitter handles, websites, people can go check out your games, follow more of your opinions on things.
So I'm at Renegade Owner on Twitter, and Cover the Core is at www.coverthecore.renegadeapplications.com. I don't have a website yet for Codefall, but it'll be available on the App Store hopefully in about 6 or 7 days.
Gotcha, which should actually be probably by the time this podcast airs. So maybe it's even out there already.
That's good. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, I appreciate yours. Music at the start and end of this podcast is provided by Danny Baranowski. Use with permission.